This video will be about the ways that suffering is necessary. Necessary for a good life, a deep life, a happy life, also necessary for life itself, necessary perhaps for being. Now, I approach this topic with trepidation. To talk about suffering in this way seems to border on the sacrilegious. Because suffering is bad, despite being necessary and contributing to good, as I hope to show. Great suffering is terrible and horrifying, the worst thing we can experience. It can easily be overwhelming and destructive, and it is ultimately out of our control. So talking about it as necessary therefore risks trivializing it, attempting to explain it away or fit it into some rational system, to pretend it's not there or doesn't have the terrible character that it does. It may seem, therefore, that the only right way to deal with it intellectually is to keep silent. But my intention here is not to trivialize it or to explain it away. Let me make that clear from the outset. I don't think there's a way to remove its negative and destructive character or finally overcome it with the mind. Suffering remains bad. My intention instead is to combat an opposite intellectualizing tendency of responding to the badness of suffering by denying its necessity to existence, or of recognizing its necessity but condemning existence due to its badness. Instead, I want to maintain that existence is good, even though suffering is necessary for it. In short, that one can take an affirmative stance toward life without self-deception. I'll come back to this at the end of the video. First, I need to show how suffering is necessary. I'll proceed roughly from the most obvious or surface ways through to the deepest ways. And the first way that suffering is necessary is that it's necessary for self-preservation. And this is the most obvious way. We can focus to begin with on just pain and its role in the body, its role for an organism. What's the purpose of pain? Is to signal that there's some damage to the body, that there's some disease in the body, that there's some danger there. And so it's basically, you could say on this level at least, an evolved mechanism to preserve the organism, to alert the organism, and not only alert the organism, but actually push it to act. That's its highly negative character. It's not just a signal like a piece of information, like a flashing light or something like that. It's something that grips us entirely, and by its very nature forces us to act, and to act in a way usually to preserve ourselves, to remove the cause of the pain, to seek to treat or heal the damage. And so it's very easy to see how pain in this way is very, very helpful. And so people that actually can't feel pain or can't feel the negative aspect of pain, in the sense of the aspect that is gripping and pushing, and the aspect about pain that we don't like. People who can't feel pain or who can't feel that aspect, they generally, it's not a good kind of state to live in, because they hurt themselves quite a lot. They harm their bodies, they hurt themselves because they are not driven to act to preserve themselves. They're not driven to act to kind of protect themselves and maintain their bodies in the utmost condition. So that's all very obvious and straightforward. I probably don't even need to talk about it this long. But I also wanted to add one extra thing to this part of it, which is that obviously it's not just something internal, but it's something that we actually signal to others as well. So it's a sign of distress that others can see by our facial expression, by our vocalizations, And so this is another, you could say, evolved mechanism. This is another way that we can preserve ourselves or protect ourselves. Other people, especially, other humans, have empathy. They have empathy, they have sympathy, they respond to that. They experience somewhat of what we're experiencing and the pain that we're experiencing, and they come to help us. So that's just how humans are wired. That's obviously incredibly beneficial, because if I express pain, then maybe, my family members, or even just potentially a random person, hopefully, might come and help me and help to preserve me. Also, of course, might comfort me. So there's that aspect as well. If I'm suffering, if I'm in pain, then I don't just get the physical help, but I also get the comfort, the reassurance, the company. And so in this way, you could say pain, suffering, builds social connection. I'll develop this idea much more deeply a bit later on. And I've been talking mostly about pain. I've been talking mostly about the physiological level. But obviously, if we're evolved organisms, and we're evolved in our brains as well, it's not just physiological pain we're talking about, but it's also suffering that we're talking about. There's an element of suffering in fear. Any negative experience really is what we could talk about. So these things too probably have a role, or at least the most major ones probably have a direct role in our evolution. You can see the case with fear is pretty straightforward, avoiding things that are dangerous to us. And so physical suffering, mental suffering, all of these have the self-preservative function. So I'll move on now to another aspect that sort of builds from this. So suffering is necessary for being the organisms that we are. So I've talked about the evolutionary process. I've talked about how we are evolved to experience pain and suffering. And so if we kind of extrapolate that further, that means a couple of things. It means that we are these beings, we are human beings. To be a human being is to experience pain and suffering. If we didn't experience pain and suffering as a species, we would be something else. We'd be a different species. And we would probably look radically different. We'd probably behave radically different. And so, to the extent that we embrace and affirm who we are as the beings that we are, we are kind of obligated, you could say, to embrace and affirm those kind of negative aspects of ourselves, or those negative aspects of the experience of these beings, these biological beings that we are. Another aspect, or another thing that comes out of this, is that if we consider the role that suffering played to bring us about, so the suffering of all those beings that in some way, positively, directly, or negatively, indirectly, led to us. So we're talking about evolution. This is a process that depends upon death, at least death, and in the sense that death is painful for most beings, if not all beings, it depends upon suffering. It involves a kind of weeding out and a refining of traits through a process of subtraction or weeding out via death. So this is essentially, necessarily, a process that is going to involve death, and to the extent that death involves pain and suffering, is going to involve pain and suffering. And again, it seems like I think probably all living beings experience pain to some degree, but certainly a lot of more developed living beings do experience pain. We can say that with relative certainty. And so certainly our more recent ancestors experienced pain and suffering. And so we only exist here as we are today because of the whole evolutionary process and all the suffering that was involved in it. So, as I sort of talked about in the previous slide, We've got when suffering is successful, when it performs its evolutionary function in the organism, which is to preserve that organism. Obviously, that probably played a role in many, many of our ancestors in that they avoided their deaths through the suffering that they experienced, through the pain that they experienced, through the signal and the information that it was giving them. They preserved their lives, and therefore we are here today. And of course, there's also the unsuccessful suffering, the suffering that ended simply in death and that prevented the organism from reproducing. And that pruned the evolutionary tree, that shaped the species that evolved out of each other, that shaped ultimately who we are. So whichever way you look at it, to the extent that we affirm ourselves as beings and we affirm ourselves as biological beings, we have to include in that the reality of suffering. We have to include in that affirmation, at least on some way, on some level, the reality of suffering that was necessary to bring us about. Okay, so on to this next point. This is kind of, in a way, a further development of the first slide, which is about self-preservation. So I've titled this Navigating Toward the Good. So suffering is necessary to help us navigate toward the good. The good is a vague term, but it's deliberately vague to try and capture as much as possible. So one way you could think about this is, well, when we experience too much chaos in our lives, in our psyches, obviously you could easily say that about the body. That's essentially what the first slide was about. But there's a sense in which chaos and suffering come together. So if myself, my life, my space, my relationships are disordered, they're breaking down, that's a kind of impinging of death into my world, into my reality. And so it makes sense that we would experience suffering about that. The correlation of suffering and chaos is quite easy to understand, I think, or quite intuitive. What's maybe not so immediately intuitive, though, is the association of order with suffering. Generally, we want to avoid things breaking down. We have to work quite hard to do that. But too much order can also be painful. If we think about a tyrannical state, if we think about a tyrannical family, if we think about just being incredibly severe and rigid with ourselves, with our own lives, not allowing any form of play, not allowing any form of humor, of free exploration. These things can also be experienced as painful. They can be experienced as constricting, suffocating. Suffering also comes from this as well. So there's a sense there then we're not just sort of saying that suffering is the result of chaos, but we're saying more that suffering is the result of too much chaos or too much order. So then, what's the usefulness of this? That suffering can actually orient us to the right balance of the two. Because we need both in our lives to live a good life. And so suffering can sort of signal to us, just like it can signal the presence of damage in the body, it can signal that we are going too far to one side or the other. Too much chaos or too much order. This is very Jordan Peterson related. if viewers are familiar with that kind of approach, I think it's basically true. Now, there's other ways in which, or related ways in which suffering can orient us toward the good. And so one of these is if we do actually act badly. So generally that generates suffering for us. Now, it might be guilt, that is to say a more direct suffering as a result of I have done badly, I have acted badly, I have been bad, I've missed the mark. It could be guilt. So that's an incredibly useful form of suffering because it leads to repentance and it leads to, as much as possible, rectifying the situation, the negative situation that we have caused. And it also promotes the flourishing of virtue. It could also be that initially, at least, it's not a sense of guilt that we feel, but it's a sense of the suffering that our vicious actions have caused us in our lives. For instance, if we just follow our immediate passions all the time, well, immediately at least, that will lead to a pleasant result. Ultimately, those negative things that we're doing or avoiding doing, or the good things we're avoiding doing, they'll all accumulate and our life will be pretty bad, pretty disordered, pretty miserable. And that sense of suffering could prompt us to ask ourselves, well, what are we doing wrong? And maybe then experience some guilt and then rectify it. So in either case, suffering is signaling something is wrong here. Something is wrong. And a change of orientation is needed. So also repentance. So when we get to the actual stage of repentance, I've done wrong and I'm sorry for it. Well, suffering is actually intrinsic to that experience. Repentance is a positive experience, you could say. Certainly on the whole, it's a positive experience, but it also necessarily includes suffering within it because we are suffering for the bad things that we did. We experience the sorrow over doing those bad things. So repentance is a reorientation that requires suffering. And then we might think about punishment. So not something that's just happening internal to myself, but something that's actually imposed upon me by society. So punishment is incredibly useful. It depends upon suffering. I guess nowadays you have more of an emphasis on rehabilitation. But I think that it's impossible to, and essentially kind of hypocritical to try and claim to remove that punishment aspect from whatever you want to call it, rehabilitation or punishment. You can't really remove that aspect from it. If you lock someone in prison, you can say, well, this is just for the protection of society, or this is actually going to be conducive to their own good, or whatever. But actually you are causing them considerable suffering, and that's the point. And I think that will always come out. And that's not a bad thing. That's a necessary thing to maintain society. So punishment constrains evil. Obviously, you're literally removing people from society, or you're inflicting some pain on them in some way, or both. In the case of imprisonment, you're inflicting some pain on them. Ideally, you're creating a sense of fear, dread, or at least some apprehension or some calculation of, well, look, if I was caught doing this, what would be the negative consequences? So, all societies have punishment. Punishment is necessary to society. And so there's a social level of, there's the social usefulness as well for suffering. And, in an ideal case, this would, lead to the individual's willing reorientation to the good. But even if it doesn't, that doesn't much matter for the social level. The point for the social level is to use these negative phenomena to constrain evil. And so you could say suffering is necessary for society in this way. It depends upon the threat of suffering and, of course, the experience of suffering. And you could also say, in a more deeper sense, that entails suffering just because it entails people to limit themselves, to adjust themselves, to constrain themselves in relation to each other. Just like being an adult requires suffering, or being oriented to the future requires suffering. So society also just necessarily requires suffering because it requires self-restraint and self sort of pruning, I guess you could say, or and generally we wouldn't think about these things as being especially bad or maybe use the term suffering for them. But I think that we should just use the term suffering for negative experiences. We shouldn't sort of reserve it for just those things that we think that existence could do without. I think that by including all these things in the category of suffering, all these negative phenomena, then we can better, ultimately, which is what I'm pushing towards, affirm existence as just being like, yes, this experience is bad and existence is good. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there. So another way that suffering is necessary, it's necessary. So these are all very related to each other. It's necessary for connection, truth, and a sense of reality. So what do I mean about that exactly? So I mean the connection to the world. So we can actually kind of intuit this relatively easily if we think about it physically. So if we think about physical pain, we can think about it as a phenomenon that connects us to physical reality. It is the way in which the physical world can be really felt as being independent from us. So it's not just like a dream or a daydream that we think up. It doesn't just exist in our minds. It's not dependent on our will. It can actually go against us. It can actually hurt us. It is its own independent reality. It can even overwhelm and destroy us, which the experience of pain and suffering in their more severe forms kind of intimate. So you could see pain as being the physical world encroaching on us in some way. Now, obviously, you could say, well, why doesn't pleasure have the same connective abilities? Obviously, pleasure can have some great connective abilities, but the problem with pleasure as in terms of connecting us with the world is, again, the sense that, well, it kind of indicates to us that things are going just as we want them to go. So there's the sense of independence, but there's also the sense of just the sheer force of pain and suffering, which seems to have more of a, let's say, a sting or an intensity or a immediacy than many kinds of pleasure and happiness. So suffering or pain, physical pain, connects us to the physical world, but we could also see that more broadly as suffering connecting us to reality. Because if we talk about reality generally, and we talk about reality in relation to ourselves, we're basically talking about the same kind of relationship. Is reality just a projection of my own mind? Is reality just a projection of my own will? Well, if that was so, we wouldn't expect this considerable suffering that we experience when we confront reality, when we clash with reality. Reality has a frustrating independence. And so in this way, suffering can be conducive to the development of a truthful apprehension of reality. It can be conducive to truth. Truth which is also connection. Truth which is also this kind of connection or coming into contact with reality itself. And there's some related things as well. So it can lead to a sense of vulnerability. I mean, that should be fairly straightforward. If we are capable of suffering, if we've experienced suffering, we know the ways it can overwhelm us. It can verge on the unbearable or feel unbearable. We know that it signifies damage and destruction and death. And so all of these lead to a sense of vulnerability. But I would say that vulnerability isn't solely negative. That vulnerability also gives us the experience of preciousness, the preciousness of human lives, the preciousness of lives in general. So yes, our lives are vulnerable. Yes, our lives could end at any moment. Yes, we are vulnerable in the face of great suffering. It may break us. It may swallow and destroy us. And yet, these moments of connection with others, these moments of relative joy, these moments of relative flourishing, and also our lives themselves are for that reason precious. The distinction between our existence and our non-existence, the distinction between our flourishing and happiness and our misery and suffering, that distinction is really clear. That distinction, the positive aspect stands out against the background of the negative aspect. The light stands out against the dark. And so in that sense, we have a greater sense of reality. We have a greater sense of preciousness. If it were otherwise, if we could never suffer, if we could never die, I think that life would just be a whole lot of grey. And we would lose the sense of even life being something really definite, really valuable. It would all be, everything would sort of be not living, but halfway between living and dead. Not joyful, but halfway between joyful and, miserable or bored or whatever. And then following on from this preciousness and vulnerability, we have the sense of humility. Because we know we are vulnerable, we should be humble. And I think that if we're honest, especially if we have a truthful perception of reality, which hopefully it also allows us to do, we have a sense of, wow, we are so small in the face of reality. And what are my powers compared to the powers of reality? It should make us humble. And I think in that humility, in that vulnerability, and in that preciousness, in all of these things together, it can actually give us a stronger connection to others. So not only to the world, not only to reality, but also to each other. Because we know that we are vulnerable. We know that our lives are precious. We know that we can suffer. But we know that everyone else is also like that as well. Everyone else is in the same essential existential position that we are. And that can give us a feeling of connection. That can give us a feeling of care. That can give us a feeling of camaraderie. And our humility should allow us to let go of those things that are keeping us from connecting with other people in that way, or identifying with other people in that way, because we are not the special center of the universe, and we are not more powerful, and we are in the same existential position as other people, basically. So can actually strengthen that really strengthen that sense of connection with others. Okay, so now we come to virtue. Suffering is necessary for virtue. And before we go into virtue proper, I think a really clear way that we can see this is by thinking about something maybe analogous to virtue, maybe a prerequisite for virtue, which is strength. So suffering is indispensable for physical and psychological strength. So physical strength is clear. I mean, when we exercise our muscles, in essence, we, first of all, it causes pain, it causes suffering, and essentially it causes a whole lot of micro damage to those muscles that then repair in such a way that the muscle is stronger. So we couldn't get from A to B. We couldn't get from, weak muscles to strong muscles without undergoing that suffering. And that works really in a way on every level and in every aspect of life. So we can talk about psychological strength as well as physical strength. Psychological strength can only be developed. I can't think of another way that it could be developed unless maybe to some extent it was kind of inherent in one's character. But certainly for most of us, the most crucial part of the psychological strength that we have has been developed through actual suffering. It has been developed through enduring suffering. It has been developed in the way that we encounter suffering and the way that we endure it. And so that when we're a small child, the slightest suffering can seem overwhelming. When we're a full-grown adult, the same suffering is completely trivial. And in general, as we grow, our capacity, our psychological strength grows as well. That's assuming that we are basically oriented to the good. Obviously, if we go down some sort of addictive spiral, or some vicious negative behavior that kind of just narrows us down, that's a different story. But generally, as we grow stronger because we grow through experience, and that experience necessarily includes suffering. And so we grow through suffering. We become stronger through suffering. And what's really fascinating is, in terms of rites of passage throughout the world, particularly passing from boyhood to manhood, pain seems to be an integral part of this. Pain or suffering in some form. I think there is an Amazonian tribe in particular that's quite renowned for this, which uses bullet ants. Bullet ant bites. That's the initiatory ritual, that the boys cover their hands with bullet ants, which apparently the bite or the sting of that is equivalent to a gunshot wound. And so that's quite intense. And there's other kinds of things as well, obviously: circumcision, scarification, piercing, just beating, whatever it may be. These rites of passage enable a transition into a new state. There's perhaps many different reasons why this might be. They may lead to a kind of dissociation that then allows like a reassociation with an adult identity, a reassociation with the myths, the rules of the tribe, the tribe itself in a more solid way. But I think that, and obviously it plays a function just in demonstrating one's masculine strength, which is critical in obviously being a man. And so there's probably a lot of different ways that, reasons why pain is used in these rites. But I think what's kind of key, what's a common factor maybe, is that that intense suffering, that intense pain allows for a kind of self-transcendence. So one starts with one particular identity, one particular configuration of their psyche, and then one moves to a different identity, a different configuration. But how does one get from A to B? There has to be a kind of self-transcendence, and suffering can actually allow for that self-transcendence. Now that can obviously go terribly wrong, and these rites of passage are very constrained. They're culturally informed. They have precedent. Everyone's been through them themselves who are facilitating them, right? So this is very constrained. This is different from a simply traumatic situation, which is unconstrained, unexpected, etc., etc. Although I do think that the two are basically the same kind of phenomenon, just like I think that suffering should include everything, every negative experience. Rites of passage probably necessarily involve, at least the violent or the painful rites of passage necessarily involve a kind of controlled trauma. But that trauma allows for a kind of self-transcendence, which allows one to make a very fast move to a new state of being, to a new stage of life. So now turning to virtue proper, suffering. So if we think of the virtues, the most obvious one that suffering pertains to is courage or fortitude. This is Botticelli's rendition or personification of fortitude. So facing suffering, enduring suffering courageously, boldly. If there was no suffering, there would be no courage. It wouldn't be meaningful to talk about it, and also it just wouldn't develop because, again, strength develops through enduring suffering. Virtue develops through the practice of virtue, and courage develops through actually being courageous, through actually facing uncomfortable and painful situations and getting through that willingly and in a way that is just sort of with just honest foresight about that, without a kind of turning away or a self-denial or a denial of the reality of the suffering. So willingly facing suffering, that's something like courage, and that would be impossible if there were no suffering. And we just know as human beings that courage is a good thing. It's a good thing to have. Courageous people are good, are good and admirable people. I think we could also make the same argument for all the virtues. There's an element of suffering in all the virtues. Now, like I said, to acquire virtue, we have to practice it. We have to therefore resist the current dispositions, the current desires that we have. Virtue always involves a kind of overcoming of the disagreeable. So again, it might just be discomfort, but it involves an overcoming of the disagreeable. If we're going to practice, let's say, temperance, for instance, which is more about resisting the allure of pleasure, or subordinating pleasure to sort of a meaningful balance, a harmony or a balance. If we think of temperance, then that also involves overcoming disagreeableness, because we're overcoming the disagreeableness of thwarting our immediate desires, of thwarting the satisfaction of our immediate desires. Prudence involves a kind of a resting of one's mind away from the immediate moment, a focus on the future, and a subordination of what one does to that future state. And so all of this again is overcoming the disagreeable. Justice involves not just taking for oneself, but actually perhaps giving something up if it justly should go to someone else, or whatever it may be. All the virtues involve, it seems to me, and obviously those are just the cardinal ones that I've mentioned there, but all the virtues involve this aspect of overcoming the disagreeable for their acquisition. And I would also just say also for their exercise, especially in the case of courage, for their exercise, because courage isn't meaningful if you're not facing suffering, or you're not facing the prospect of suffering. It loses its meaning. If we wanted to look at the theological virtues, I think a similar situation would obtain. So that is to say, faith, hope, and love in the Christian tradition. Because faith and hope are sort of this looking beyond the suffering that one currently experiences and the prospect of suffering for the future, looking above that and beyond that to something that grounds one's hope or one's faith, and sort of choosing to believe in that, and choosing to orient oneself to that. So again, it involves this overcoming of the disagreeable, this overcoming of the immediate. And then if we think of agape or love, self-giving love, self-sacrificial love, then this is obviously, at least to me, something that involves suffering. For a Christian, the most, magnificent and clearest example of agape, of self-sacrificial love, is Christ himself dying on the cross. And so if I'm not sacrificing, if I'm not therefore inflicting some loss on myself, is self-sacrificial love so meaningful? We'll talk about this probably on the last slide, where we get into sort of more spiritual, religious matters. But for now, if we're just thinking about it in the human way, if we think about parental love, for instance, it involves giving of oneself to one's child, sacrificing one's time, one's attention, one's resources for the sake of one's child, which is totally good and appropriate. But it does involve suffering on some level, even if it's mixed with joy, but it would also at the same time involve suffering. So self-sacrificial love, or agape, necessarily involves suffering, as do, I think, probably all the virtues. I haven't gone through one by one, but it seems to me that all of them, for their exercise, for their acquisition, involve the overcoming of suffering, or the transcendence of suffering, or having the right relationship to suffering in some way. So, suffering is necessary for happiness. So, there's different levels on which this is true. So, on the first level, on the more immediate level, we could say that pleasure and joy, so happiness, good emotions, positive emotions, they depend on the negative emotions, they depend on suffering for contrast. So we're talking for now just in that more limited sense of contrast. So it seems that, quite a few pleasures that we experience, or a few positive emotions that we experience, are actually intimately related to the absence of suffering. So if we've been suffering and then we find relief from that suffering, then that itself is a pleasure. So for instance, if we're hungry and then we eat, obviously there's a certain positive pleasure in the taste of the food, but even if the food is entirely bland, the alleviation of that hunger is itself a pleasure. So that would be just the most obvious way. Or if we avoid suffering, the relief that we feel having avoided a potential suffering, again, is intrinsically connected to the possibility of suffering. Or if we experience pleasure or joy having undergone suffering for a good purpose, no longer undergoing it, but having undergone it in a meaningful way, that also is directly related to that positive emotion. And even, I would say, even if you're experiencing present joy, presently you're experiencing joy, but not in one of these more direct ways, that is not in one of these more direct ways linked to suffering. It could still be linked to suffering in the sense that you understand, you're aware, it's in your consciousness that suffering is possible. And if you dwell on this, and it doesn't take you to a dark place, it could, and you can just sort of accept suffering as being part of the universe, without sort of rebelling against being. If you can kind of just entertain the fact that suffering exists, suffering is possible, but you don't presently have it, you presently have joy, then that can actually enhance the experience of that present joy, because you know that you might not have had it, and in fact you might have had the opposite. And so that you have this joy now, again, it becomes somewhat precious, and it becomes somewhat more intense in your consciousness because you know that the alternative is possible. But we could go deeper than those sort of aspects that are based on kind of conscious contrast. We could go deeper than that, and we could just talk about the way that suffering and joy are interdependent in their very being. That joy, kind of as a concept and as a reality, as a phenomenon, it implies its opposite. So, joy is meaningful as the opposite of suffering. Suffering is meaningful as the opposite of joy. And these are sort of related in this way. We kind of inherently understand this relatedness of these two different phenomena. And I think I've seen somewhere there's the sort of proposal of while we could replace suffering with, and obviously this is either just pure philosophical thought experiment or kind of crazy transhumanist aspiration, but the proposal would be we can replace suffering with gradations of pleasure. So that if suffering can still, you can still get a sense of contrast, you can still get the informational usefulness that suffering and pain provide, but instead of actually feeling this negative experience, you'll just feel like a lower gradation of pleasure or a lower gradation of joy. And when things get better for you, you get that signal of a higher gradation of joy. And so people can sort of have contrast, they can get by in the world, but they don't have to be, they don't have to have suffering inflicted on them. But I think that this is just absurd, because I think that as self-aware beings, it's just in consciousness, it's just in, and I would say it's probably just in being, but it's just an inescapable fact, you could say, that that suffering and joy are in fact interdependent. And we can see this if we had that system of gradations from let's say no joy but also no suffering through to intense joy and everything in between. I think we would experience any decrease, any descent in gradation of joy, we'd just experience that as suffering. And I think that people actually do experience that as suffering in their own life. I mean, if we have, like, which is most of us in the Western developed world, lots of good things, and then we sort of lose one of them, or something mildly unfortunate happens in our lives, we actually experience that as suffering. We don't just experience that as a different gradation of joy. And I think that's because it's intrinsic to have these opposites. And so they'll always reestablish themselves, even if we sort of somehow came up with some system of gradations of joy. They're always present, they're always there. So if we're conscious of joy, we have to, we're inherently conscious of, at least implicitly, conscious of suffering. If we understand the possibility for joy, we understand the possibility for suffering. These two go together, and suffering and joy interpenetrate, and they dance throughout all our lives, and there's nothing really that we can do about it. This is just the way that these phenomena are inherently related. At least that seems to be true to me. Maybe I'm missing something there, but it seems that this relationship is inherent. Okay, so another aspect or another reason why suffering is necessary to limited beings like ourselves and to life itself. So these in a way are related but two separate things. So I'll deal with this first point first, this sense that suffering is necessary for limited beings like ourselves. And we are in fact limited beings. We're limited by space. We have a specific spatial extension, right? Our body takes up a certain space. We're limited in time. We were born, we had a beginning, and we will end. We're also limited in terms of our qualities. We're not sort of like everything that exists, but we have very specific qualities. We have very specific capacities. We can't do everything possible. We are given very specific goods that applies to just the species of humanity, but also just each individual human. There's kind of a diversity and an inequality there necessarily. So all this limitation, well, what does that mean? Well, what that translates into is actually, obviously, suffering. So if we just look at the example of space, we encounter the force and resistance of other objects. That's why we're limited in space, or that's a part of, an intrinsic part of our spatial limitation. If I walk, I can't walk through the wall, can't extend through the wall, can't be the wall, but I can hit the wall and I can, hurt myself. Objects push against each other. And we'll talk about this in much more depth, I think, in a minute. We'll go a bit deeper into that. But basically, things hit each other, things encounter each other, things limit each other, forces resist each other. And this is inherent to being a spatially limited being. Time again. So our lives are constituted by, they're constituted by death and they're circumscribed by death. So they're constituted by death because our lives are made up of all these little deaths. So all the cells in our body are continually dying and being replaced, most of them. And that's just good and necessary for a healthy body. I mean, maybe people might think this is a bit too just, metaphorical or just indulging in analogies, but I think that death also constitutes sort of every level, every layer of being. So if we think about evolving as a person, evolving as a personality, evolving with one's different, limited, but like specific qualities, capacities, etc. So the trajectory that one takes over one's life, developing as their own individual person, that's constituted by death as well, because it involves letting go of, it involves the death of previous dispositions. Even improving in something sort of involves the death of that previous personality, that previous configuration of self that wasn't as adept, that wasn't as good at the thing that you're doing. Becoming less vicious and more virtuous involves the death of the vicious. So You could also just talk about time itself, to be honest, and you could talk about memory, and you could talk about, we don't simultaneously remember all things that have happened to us at once, but our memories fade into the background. Sometimes they just die completely and we can't retrieve them. But we progress as a being, and as we progress, those parts of ourself from the past, a lot of them die, and that's necessary because we're dynamic beings. And then, of course, circumscribed by death is pretty straightforward. It just means that we're literally going to die. We're going to end. Our bodies are going to die. They're going to cease to be alive, cease breathing. Blood's going to stop circulating. The brain's going to stop functioning, and we're going to die. And then, I think probably that's going to be the end of ourselves. But, it might not be. But as the being that I am, at least, I'm pretty convinced that it is the end, because again, we are limited beings, and to be a limited being is to have an end, I think. And so I've actually talked about this to some degree in the video that I have most recently made, which is about eternal life. So check that out if you want to sort of talk about these issues of time, death, ending, can you be a personality forever, etc. Okay, so I've talked about limited beings and now life itself. So why is suffering necessary for life itself? Because life itself is dynamic. Life itself is a process. And I think, at least, and I'm drawing from Nietzsche here, but I think that life is inherently a process of growth, expansion, and self-overcoming. So why exactly is this the case? I mean, for a start, life clearly is a process, or at least on the biological level, it clearly is a process. And I would say also on the psychological level, it's a process. It's not some static thing. It's actually dynamic. It's always moving. It's always striving. It's always oriented in some way, in some direction. It's change. It's always change. Time is always flowing within one's experience, within one's internal experience. Through one's experience of the world. And so it seems that all those aspects of life that we can observe, internal, external, biological, psychological, involve the sense of process. And I would say that furthermore, that process has a fundamental direction. We can see that as well in the sense that our life wants to not only just maintain itself, but also to expand. Like, we don't just want to, most of us don't want to just kind of sit here and cling on to what we have to life without expanding, without improving, without gaining more. This can look like the most virtuous activities. It can also look like vicious activities in the sense of just acquiring. But in either way, there's a sense of wanting more to life, to our lives. And we can see this also in organisms in general. And we can see this in the evolutionary process in general, in the sense that it kind of generates these, over time, more complex organisms in just the mere direction of reproduction, reproducing more of your own species, the way that species expand and spread out in an environment and clash with other organisms, which we'll talk about in a minute. A sense of self-overcoming, which again we can certainly see in our own lives, and I think particularly if we're oriented more towards sort of virtue, but also in every respect, I think that our lives are a process of overcoming the past, whether in a good direction or a bad direction, and ideally a sense of overcoming ourselves, overcoming those kind of lowest, most unintegrated drives, integrating them, directing them, achieving, accomplishing, and also, tied in with biological reproduction, tied in with sexuality, sexual desire, the desire for power. I think all of these are clearly ambivalent. They're not just bad, they're not just good, but they are a fundamental direction to life. They are a fundamental direction to life. So I can't make a completely, I can't make a complete argument in the short time that I have for this video. But I think that if we look at the world of life, if we look at organisms in general and all their variety all over the world, if we look at ourselves, if we look into ourselves and consider our motivations, our energy, our nature of our consciousness, the nature of our psyche, I think we can see that this is basically true. Life is a dynamic process oriented towards growth, expansion, self-overcoming. That seems to be true. And so I guess another way to look at it would be what the alternative would be. And it's not at all clear what that would be. Some kind of static substance, a substantial soul, a substantial self, outside of time, unchanging within time. What does that mean exactly? Why does that manifest in time as such a dynamic process? Why does that manifest in time as this striving? The model of a static self, a model of life which is inherently static, doesn't make much sense, nor does a life that is only concerned with self-preservation. That doesn't seem to make as much sense. It's not just about self-preservation, but the exercise of one's powers, the expansion and the self-overcoming of life. And so that would be, to me, what's compelling, what's really compelling about this view. It fits my understanding or my experience of myself and of the world and of all life or forms of life that I know about, that they exhibit expansion, growth, and self-overcoming as dynamic processes. And so inherent in a process of growth, expansion, and self-overcoming is that life moves from a state of, it continually moves from one state to another. That would be the best way of putting it. So it's not just resting in one state. It's not just saying, now I'm satisfied, now I've accomplished it, that's the end, everything's okay. But by its very nature, it's moving. And so by its very nature of moving on and on, expanding and growing as a phenomenon, as a process, then each new state it reaches must eventually become bad. It must eventually become negative. It must eventually, therefore, involve some degree of suffering, because we need to leave it behind, because we want to reject it and seek a further joy in the future. And so we achieve that joy, and then that state becomes dull, that state becomes stagnant, that state becomes prone to suffering, and then we seek a further joy, and this process continues on and on forever. So obviously in these little diagrams here I've just got from bad to good. That could be deceptive on the bottom, bad to good, suffering to joy. That could be deceptive because it might imply that the end point, that there's an end point to the process, but there's not. It's bad to good, to bad to good, to bad to good, etc., onwards and onwards, essentially forever. Now, the key thing is, I guess, the terms at the top. Good, capital G, good, and capital J, joy. So this idea, which is basically a Nietzschean idea, but I think really resonates with science and really resonates with just our direct experience of reality. This idea is that the process itself is joyful. The process of life expanding and overcoming itself is a joyful process. And again, I think that if we look at our lives, which are themselves, our individual lives are processes, and they're composed of processes, the processes of our cells and so forth, we can get the sense that this is true. We can get the sense that it's actually in the dynamism of life, the expansive dynamism of life, that the joy lies. It's not in one specific state that one accomplishes, but it's in the dynamic process of growth that the joy, the real joy, the deep joy resides. But for that to be possible, suffering has to be part of that system. It has to be part of that system in a different way as well, because it's self-overcoming, and self-overcoming involves death, right? It also has to be part of it in a way because if you've got more than one being, or at least more than one individual being, those beings are going to clash, and that produces suffering, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But even if we consider one individual and their own internal process, it has to, that joyous, good, dynamic process of life expanding has to include suffering, because it has to include the overcoming of stagnant states. It has to include movements from achieved state to further state in the future, to better state in the future. And so suffering is implied by the process, but, and this is key, the suffering isn't primary. It's the joy that requires the suffering. The suffering doesn't require the joy, so to speak. Suffering doesn't have the same primacy. So there's this goodness, or this joy, capital J joy, capital G goodness, that embraces the whole process. That is essentially the whole process. And suffering is dependent on that. Suffering is produced by that, let's say, as a necessary part of that process. And this goes very much against, let's say, Schopenhauer's interpretation of existence, where he sort of noted this pattern that we want something in the future, we desire something, we achieve it, and it doesn't satisfy us fully forever. We get a momentary sense of what he might interpret as relief from the itch of dissatisfied desire. We get a momentary kind of negative pleasure, and then we go back to sort of just, yearning again. And so he sort of tips the whole thing around and says, it's suffering is primary, joy is secondary, and it's only negative. I don't think that's the case. I think that life is a process. For life is a process, the joy is primary. The suffering is necessary to that process, but the process itself can be characterized by joy, not by suffering. And so that's basically the model there. One more thing I should also say about this is that this process of life is essentially joyful on the level of life itself, not necessarily on the level of the individual being. So the individual being can be overwhelmed by suffering, destroyed by suffering, psychologically or physically. The individual being is, again, precious and fragile. But the individual being is instantiation of the joyful, let's say, universal or fundamental process of life. That's what's joyful. So I just wanted to make that clear, because again, in terms of individual suffering, in terms of the suffering of limited beings, of actual individual beings and lives, and on this level, I guess you could say there's tragedy. On this level, suffering can easily overwhelm. But I also think that it's true that fundamental joy of life itself can be, let's say, tapped into. And I think that it can kind of, what would the word be? It can kind of communicate itself to our individual lives. It can permeate our individual lives. And I think that one way that we can actually do that is by affirming being itself, is by affirming the process aspect, the dynamic aspect of being. Because when we do that, I think we can get more into a state of identification with this more fundamental level. And we can get a sense of the joy of that fundamental level and the goodness of that fundamental level of being, even if we are experiencing some suffering. I don't say that guarantees us against being overwhelmed by severe suffering. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that fundamental joy of life could manifest in an individual life as well. Can be accessed by an individual life as well. I talk about this in more depth in a video that I did on a philosopher called Richardson's analysis of Nietzsche and how he interprets Nietzsche, and he sort of talks about this in more depth. So I'll put a link to that video in the description, and you can have a look at that if you're interested. Okay, so now we're going deep. Now we're going even deeper. So we're going to the level of being itself. We're not just talking about life, but we're talking about being. Now, if we take a Nietzschean approach, which is an approach I'm sympathetic to, then those two levels in a way are combined, because the being itself is essentially life. But let's look at the physical level, because it's more, again, it's more easy to understand, and it's more easy to see, to recognize. So on the physical level, we can see that all bodies are constituted by force and resistance. So bodies being in the most general sense of like human bodies, animal bodies, plant bodies, whatever, right down to like molecules, atoms, like all these things are constituted by forces. So, and they relate to each other through force and resistance. Or to put it a different way, the force of one being, one entity, and the force of another entity. When those forces clash, then you get this sense of, you get this resistance. And again, that's why I spatially can't be everywhere. I'm spatially limited because there's resistance from outside of me. But we could go to the metaphysical level, and we could say that all beings are constituted by force and resistance, not just physical entities, but every entity, regardless of whether that's the same as physical entities or not. Maybe there's other entities. Or maybe, like Nietzsche, it's better characterized as life. But in any case, we're still talking about this sort of idea of force and resistance. Perhaps it's something to do with individual entities, right? Particularity itself, individuality itself, that involves these ideas of force and resistance, that involves force. And in Nietzschean terms, it would be will to power. So basically the same thing, I would say, but with the sense that it's life that is the subject of these things. And it's got sort of like a directedness. But basically, I think we can talk about it in the more scientific language of force. But I would say we don't need to be physicalists, and we don't need to be kind of Nietzschean vitalists to understand the dependence of beings on force and resistance. We can see this to some degree in our own minds and our own psyches. We can see sort of different subpersonalities, different desires, different preoccupations jostling each other, maybe submitting one another to each other, gaining ascendancy, receding. We can kind of understand it on the level of societies, if we take those as individual beings, in the relation between different societies. There is also, again, this kind of force and resistance. I come thus far, but I can't go any further, and yet I want to expand or exert force. It seems that if we look at all the different phenomena that exist, we see a similar kind of thing. There does seem to be this kind of force and resistance between individual particular beings, and that seems to be necessary. It seems to be necessary, and again, this is kind of more clear on the physical level, because we can understand that actually, the molecules that make up my cells, that make up my body, are bound by forces. Like, they are bound by forces, and they are excluded from just sort of merging into each other, also by forces. Their arrangement, their functioning, all of this is a kind of dance of force and resistance. So that seems clear. It gets a little more murky when we're talking about other kind of metaphysical entities, but I think that the same basic principle obtains, even if we're talking about other principles by which the universe or by which reality functions. I think we still need to conserve the sense of force and resistance in order to understand phenomena, to understand individual things. For instance, if I do give myself away in self-giving love, if I do practice agape, even to an extreme degree, even to a degree that claims my life, for instance, there is the question of, well, who am I as a being? How did I get to be an individual being? And who are you for who I am giving my life? Who are you as a being? And it seems that there is an irreducible element of ownness, of self-assertion, of metabolic consumption of one's environment to make these individual selves, as well as the necessity of sort of psychological consumption of egotism, especially early in life, where that egotism is essential. So we don't get rid of the principle of force or resistance, or if you want to use that term, violence, by invoking other principles. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But when we're talking about individual beings, particular beings, especially in relation to each other, it seems that we are actually dealing with this model of force and resistance, or of power or violence, or whatever you want to call it. So in this model then, suffering is the reaction of a will to resistance encountered or violence impinging upon it. So in other words, it wants to expand, it faces resistance, it experiences that as suffering. Just like we do. We want to expand, we want something, we face resistance, we experience that resistance to our desires as suffering. Or as violence impinging upon it. Someone harms us in some way, someone harms us socially, psychologically, physically, whatever it may be. That's their force impinging upon us, their violence impinging upon us. Both of those generate suffering. So suffering is a clash of powers. It's ontological resistance, right? It's the powers clashing together and pressing against each other. That is suffering. And again, if we look at that previous model that I talked about, that life is a process of inherent expansion and self-overcoming, then that's, that fits very nicely with that. That makes sense that would be the case. So it may be that so we can look at this at different ways. We can say that we can be a bit more ontologically speculative. We can say that maybe the experience of suffering goes all the way down. Every being that exists, every entity at every level experiences some form of suffering. This is sort of like a panpsychism of suffering, right? There's consciousness all the way down in some form, however rudimentary. Or we could sort of be a bit more grounded in current thinking, I guess, where we could say that, okay, suffering is an elaboration in conscious beings of a more basic reality. So we wouldn't use necessarily the term suffering, but that resistance, that ontological resistance, is simply experienced as suffering. The experience of ontological resistance is suffering in conscious beings and beings that are capable of experience, or capable of awareness. So that would be a similar model, and that's sort of more, I don't know, down to earth, or more kind of we're not positing consciousness in all things. We're just saying that what suffering is in conscious beings is an elaboration of, or is a translation of, this fundamental reality into awareness. Suffering is ontological resistance. Now, I want to be very clear. To say that all beings are constituted by force, are constituted by violence, if we want to use that term, to say that all beings are constituted by this is not to say that that's only, that's only what beings are constituted by, or that that's only what beings want or experience or whatever. So I just want to make that really clear, that I'm not reducing everything to force and violence. I'm just saying that this is a constitutive part of being. So we could have force and resistance, we could have violence, we could have this sort of being inherent to particular beings, which is probably just to say to beings at all, right? Because what's an infinite being anyway? Something that we can't comprehend. We could say that violence is constitutive of beings, and we could also say that love is constitutive. You could actually have both of those ontological principles at the same time. And you could maybe you could say that one is a phase of the other, or that they're phases of each other, they're a continuum. You could maybe say that, forces what is sort of prevalent at the lower and the earlier levels, and what that flourishes into is something like love. Or we could say that these are actually two forces these are two principles that balance each other, that you don't have a universe just torn apart by force. You actually also have the uniting factor of love, but without love you would have a universe sort of torn apart, but without force you wouldn't have a universe at all. You could kind of say that, there's lots of different ways that you could do it. You could say that love sort of emerges as you get more sophisticated beings, you get more social beings, and that therefore it's also inherent in the structure of being. I'm just trying to say that there's lots of different things that you could say about this without, you can accept that there is that violence, if we want to use that sort of more loaded, evocative term, or force or will to power, is constitutive of beings, and just have all the range of values that we actually have as the actual values that we have. You don't have to sort of be reductive about it and sort of collapse everything into that one principle. Now, I'm talking from my own perspective. I'm not saying that Nietzsche has the same view. I think he does have a tendency to reduce things down to the will to power, but I don't care. I think that this you can have this plurality. I'm also not committed to the plurality. I'm kind of agnostic on this whole thing because I haven't thought it through. But you could have the plurality of different values, different principles, but you could still insist that yes, but one of these principles, the fact that beings exert force on each other, and they necessarily do, and that this is experienced as violence and suffering, that's necessary and can't be done away with. So if you want the whole thing, you want the love, you want the self-sacrificial love, the agape, the joy and happiness and everything, you actually just have to accept that the violence is part of the picture too. That would kind of be where I would stand on that. And I wanted to just include a painting. I like to include paintings in my videos. This one is by Albert Bierstadt. It is called The Last of the Buffalo. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting. Even though it clearly depicts a lot of suffering and death. But what I particularly like about it, and why I included it in this video, is if you sort of just look at the main sort of focus of the painting, of that warrior on the horse driving a spear into the buffalo. The buffalo is driving his horns into the horse. So you have this clash of these immense forces, power, right? You have this clash of forces. And that is existence. That is beings. That is beings. And so that's what I sort of wanted to put across with this picture, because it puts it across so forcefully, I think. And, going on from that painting, is appropriate that we talk about beauty. I would say that suffering is necessary to beauty. I think for a start, it's an inherent part of artistic creativity. I think that there's an obvious way that this is the case. For instance, that when people have suffered or are suffering, at least to a certain point, that actually can be very stimulating for artistic creativity. It tends to give one a kind of depth. Not always, and so I'm not saying that it's... And also you can be artistically creative without suffering, or without going through a period of suffering in your life, is what I would say. But I would also say that it's inherent to creativity just in the way that it's also inherent to virtue, which is that to say artistic creativity is an exertion of oneself. So again, it's sort of like a force against a force. You are trying to bring an idea into the world in some way. You're trying to shape matter in some way to express this idea, to express this form, to express this beautiful vision in whatever way, in whatever medium. That necessarily involves resistance. So creativity involves resistance. Creativity involves suffering necessarily. If we think of the content of beautiful artworks, particularly if we think of stories, suffering is indispensable for dramatic tension. The experience or prospect of suffering by characters in stories, real prospect of suffering, is essential for a good story, because that's what a story is. A story isn't just a tale of a happy day or a happy, like a happy time in someone's life that just went completely smoothly and well. That would be a totally boring story. But for the tension, for the overcoming, for the unexpected, for the adventure, that's why we want a good story. And that's why we need suffering. We need suffering in the story. We need suffering in our lives for the story to resonate with us, to capture us, etc. The suffering, so the beauty of the natural world, if we consider the beauty of the natural world, that is also constituted by violence. Because the whole natural world is, as we've pointed out before, constituted by violence. Evolution is a violent and, death-filled and suffering-filled process. Predation is everywhere, it's necessary, it's indispensable. All the beings that we love are in this relationship, or all these beings that we sort of see as beautiful in nature are in this relationship of violence, whether that's like actual violence because they're animals, or whether that's sort of, or even plants for that matter, or whether it's just like sort of ontological violence, I suppose you could say, if we're talking about inanimate things. An interesting fact about beauty is that, and beauty and suffering, is that aesthetic suffering can be beautiful in itself. So I'm not going to focus on sort of aesthetic beauty that relies on suffering for tension that is then resolved, right? So they lived happily ever after. Obviously that applies to what I was talking about in stories, although some stories are tragedies. But for the stories that end happily, you could say that the suffering there is purely instrumental. But I would say that actually in art, in aesthetic experience, you can actually have beautiful suffering that isn't instrumental, that doesn't sort of just point beyond itself to some good goal or some happy outcome. Sad music would be a great example of that. Sad music, for most people at least, I would say, is enjoyable in itself. It's enjoyable for its very sadness. It's beautiful in its very sadness. And obviously we get to tragedy, sort of maybe the most obvious example. Suffering is essential to tragedy. Tragedy is fascinating because why do we like it so much? I mean, it so directly puts the human tragic predicament, the fact that we're limited, the fact that we can be overcome by suffering, right in front of our faces. And yet, it is beautiful. And I think that says something very deep about life and about the orientation we could have to life itself. An affirmative orientation aesthetic orientation that doesn't negate the ethical, that doesn't negate the actuality or the reality that suffering is bad, but that can embrace it in some way. The aesthetic has an ability to embrace opposites within itself. If we look at this, and this is just a detail of a Caravaggio painting, The Sacrifice of Isaac. It's a much bigger painting. But even if we just look at this this part of it, I mean, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful painting. And it expresses anguish, it expresses agony, it expresses terror so well, so perfectly. This is Abraham, obviously, about to cut the throat of his son Isaac, to sacrifice him. You can actually just see in this detail, you can see the hand of the angel reaching out to restrain Abraham's hand. So obviously the picture, in the context of the picture, it's a happy ending, I suppose you could say. But I love this image so much because I feel like it's an image of life itself in some way. We are all Isaac, being held down, about to have our throats cut in some way. If you can sense the beauty in that, I suppose, and again, in the beauty not in a way that kind of makes suffering and makes death something okay, but keeps their horribleness, keeps their terribleness. If you can sense that in an aesthetic way, I think that you've kind of taken that aesthetic, tragic approach to life. And now finally we'll talk about spiritual transformation. So this is probably as deep as we possibly can go. And for that reason, I want to be very, very cautious about what I say about this and the amount that I say about this. So I'll try and go through this quite briefly. Obviously, asceticism plays a big role in many religions. It plays a big role in the Western religions, and particularly in Christianity, and particularly in early Christianity. Self-torment, I guess, if we want to be honest about it. In Indian religions, it's tapas. So what's really interesting about that is that in Indian religions, and Jainism is particularly adept at this, tormenting the self for spiritual transformation, for spiritual enlightenment. But you see it a lot in Hinduism as well. Buddhism tended to moderate it a bit, but it's still present in some form. The idea with tapas is that it gives you power. So it could give you spiritual power, or it could give you like more kind of like magical power. So there's a fascinating correlation between undergoing suffering willingly, even inflicting suffering on oneself, and the acquisition of spiritual power, or the acquisition of, let's say, paranormal power, I suppose. And I just wanted to note that again. I don't want to go into that too deeply because I feel like it's way out of my, certainly out of my experience. It's also largely out of my knowledge. We could talk about the significance of Christ's crucifixion. This is the central image of Christianity, a man nailed to a cross, undergoing tremendous suffering, or having just died from tremendous suffering. And this is the central image of Christianity. This is the image of God himself, actually. And so, what does that say? For people familiar with Jonathan Peugeot, they may have heard him say, that there's this idea in Christianity, or in some forms of Christianity, that Christ was crucified before the foundation of the world, sacrificed before the foundation of the world, that there's a sense that the crucifixion is eternal. It's the culmination of the world in some way. So these aspects of Christianity are not actually sort of saying that suffering is something to be completely eradicated, but they're saying it's actually central. And in a way, they're saying that God himself suffered, and that he needed to suffer for the world, and the world needs to suffer for him in a way. Christ obviously unites the human and the divine nature, or that's how it's conceived. And so this image of suffering being absolutely central to creation. Now that goes against another tendency in Christianity, which is also very, very present, which is that, the eschaton, the final culminate, the final end point of creation will be a state of bliss, a state without suffering, and this sort of goes against this, and I don't see how you can have the two together. And I don't see that there's any content really in this this kind of state of eternal blessedness or lack of suffering. Within this life, getting back to this life though, and still talking about it in a Christian fashion, suffering can be purgative, suffering can purify us spiritually, at least that's the idea. And this is, again, across all religions, it's not just Christianity. Within Christianity and Catholicism particularly, you have this idea of the dark night of the soul as this withdrawal of God from your soul to purify your love, to spiritually purify you. This dark night of the soul, which is felt as intense anguish and abandonment, but which is necessary for spiritual development. It could be that suffering effectively destroys the ego or breaches the ego in some crucial way that opens one to God. This seems to have been Simone Weil's idea. She was a very, very interesting kind of mystic and philosopher in the 20th century. And so just to quote from her, "Grace fills up empty spaces, but it can only enter where there is a void to receive it, and it is grace itself which makes that void." So Weil talked a lot about this idea of affliction, which is not just ordinary suffering, it's not just any suffering, but it's suffering so intense that it kind of overwhelms the self, and it kind of creates a breach or a void in the self, and it can be the destruction of the person spiritually, or it can be their spiritual salvation, depending on how they take that. And here she's sort of just emphasizing that, I suppose, but also kind of implying that it is necessary. It is necessary for that ultimate spiritual goal, which is pure love for God, which is a kind of union with God or reunion with God. And as she says, it is grace itself which makes this void. And so again, I want to be very reticent about these subjects. If we grant that God exists, if there is this infinite being, then it appears to be the case that suffering is necessary for a kind of breakthrough to that being. It seems that suffering is intrinsic to that process, inherent to that process. So, that was the final slide that I prepared. I've tried to show in this video why suffering is necessary. And broadly speaking, we could say that this works on two levels, broadly speaking. Suffering is necessary for a good life, and suffering is necessary for any life, for life itself, and perhaps even for being itself. And I've tried to show, but both of these are true. So it's not just that maybe there is some degree of suffering or some kinds of suffering that are necessary for existence, that, those kinds of suffering needed for a good and truly happy life, and that the rest could be, in theory, excised from life, perhaps if we want to posit some afterlife of some description, some perfection of the world enacted by God, or perhaps even enacted by human beings through technology, a transhumanist dream. So that would be the case if we were just talking about some certain constrained or particular types of suffering being necessary for happiness. But that doesn't seem to be the case at all. I've tried also to show that suffering is actually constitutive of life itself, that it is something that life needs, that's something that life depends upon, and that it couldn't just be taken out. And perhaps that goes all the way down, that perhaps that's fundamental to being itself. And so we can't even posit or imagine or conceive of a situation where we could have life in any way like we know it, in any way that we can understand or relate to, and not have suffering. I don't think that it's possible. I won't rule it out completely, but I don't think that it's impossible. I can't see how it's possible. So if that's the case, if we have being, if we have life, we have suffering necessarily. And not just manageable suffering, not just suffering that's conducive to good, but just, well, at least conducive to a happy individual life, let's say, but unmanageable suffering, unpredictable suffering, destructive suffering, suffering that for the individual life is completely destructive, is completely senseless, is completely bad, that is not redeemed within the individual life. And that means that life is fundamentally tragic, I guess you could say, or at least that an individual existence, an individual life is tragic. But as I've tried to point out, that sense of tragedy doesn't have to mean just bad, negation, not acceptable, something to be rejected or denied. We can experience, in some way at least, the beauty of tragedy, especially when it's presented on the stage or in a novel or on the screen or whatever it may be. We can understand that there's some aesthetic aspect to that. We can sense also, I think, that life transcends our individual life. Life itself transcends our individual life. And perhaps we can get some intuition or some intimation of an absolute being, a ground of being, a God that can be loved, can be connected with, and that actually that connection is affected itself by suffering. So all of these go with, I would say, the tragic nature of life or of an individual life, and that help to put it in a context where maybe it can be affirmed. And so that leads me to the point with which I started this video, which is that suffering is bad, suffering is negative, suffering is not something that we should senselessly, needlessly, gratuitously increase. As human beings, we have moral responsibilities, and all of that, I think, is true. All of that is fair, but all of that is, I would say, also somewhat relative when we think about the whole picture, when we think about the big picture, when we think about being itself. So I think that, first of all, we need to be able to, and we need to, as far as we can, affirm being. And to affirm being is essentially to affirm being as it is. To affirm life as it fundamentally is, as it is constituted. And within that fundamental affirmation, we can and should reject evil and reject gratuitous suffering and ameliorate it and constrain it as far as we can. So we've got, therefore, an absolute level and a relative level. A divine level, you might say, a level that pertains to God, and a level that is relative and pertains to human beings. A level where duality holds, where duality reigns, and a level where duality dissolves or resolves into a fundamental good. Life is fundamentally affirmation. Life is fundamentally joy. Life is fundamentally goodness, but not necessarily on the level of the individual human being, although in different ways, to different degrees, perhaps we can tap into that fundamental joy of being itself. I think that we have to affirm being as it is. I was reflecting recently on a biblical passage, on what Jesus says when he is asked what the greatest commandment is. And he says, quoting from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. In other words, love God with all your being, with all your individual being, love being itself, affirm being itself. And that's the greatest commandment. And the second greatest is this: love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's the human level, that's the relative level, that's the level of duality, that's the level of affirmation and rejection, positivity and negativity. That's the level of moral responsibility. I should love my neighbor as myself. And I think that that's a really interesting pattern. And I think that resonates a lot with what I've been thinking about lately. It seems that we have to do both. We have to be virtuous as individuals. We have to affirm some things and reject others. But on a deeper level, we have to. I feel like we have to, and I feel like religion, in its essence maybe, carries this message. We have to affirm being. We have to affirm being. I think the book of Job speaks to this as well. I don't want to get into that now though, but hopefully sometime shortly in the future I'll be able to talk about that. But the idea is, yes, we have to affirm being. It's not good enough to say suffering isn't necessary. That's a kind of denial. That's a kind of self-deception. Suffering isn't necessary for existence. And we can't either condemn existence, because either we live in a performative contradiction, continuing to live, continuing to strive, whilst resentfully being against life, or we simply commit suicide. I don't think that either of those are good paths to take. I think that being is good. And so that's probably where I'll draw this video to a close. On the one hand, suffering is necessary for much of what makes life happy and fulfilling. But even where it goes beyond that, where it seems gratuitous, we can know that suffering as such is necessary. It's necessary for life. And it's at that deep level, that absolute level of life itself or of being itself, it's this level, constituted in part by suffering, that affords all the possibility for happiness, for flourishing, for individual existences, for love. It affords all of this. So the ultimate level, the basic level of being, yes, constituted by suffering, it affords all possible experience, including all the best experience, and it's valuable in itself. Being is valuable in itself, and being is joyful in itself. And so that is the kind of picture that I'm painting here. We have to do good, live well, and affirm being, knowing that suffering is necessary.